fuck. Oh, I don't know why I decided to do this. Okay, here we go. Oh, okay. Hello! How are you doing? Hi. What a beautiful day. New set, new content, new thoughts, new ideas, new intros, new beginnings. Let's get this video started. Hi, this is the second video in a mini-series I call The Ego. So if you haven't watched the previous one, I highly recommend you to. However, you will not be completely lost, but I do appreciate the extra views. In the last video, we explored what makes up the self, meaning what makes you, you, what makes me, me. After much reflection, we concluded that the self is a dynamic set of properties, some of those physical and some of those mental. But today we're taking it one step further, because if the self is just a collection of properties, what happens when those properties start to, well, change? Today we'll be discussing what I call ego death. But before we even dive into that, we have to separate ego death from physical death, because despite them sounding like similar things, they are inherently very, very, very different. We'll define physical death as like the cessation of biological functions. So some may call this when, I don't know, the heart stops beating, others may call it brain death, but I'm not a biologist, I'm not a doctor, and we're not here to talk about what physical death is. But ego death is very different. Instead of it being the physical, biological cessation of bodily functions, it's more the cessation of the self as we know it. You can call it the dissolution of the self, or the destruction of the self, or as I call it, the death of the self. Now, you might have actually heard the term ego death before, especially when talking about psychedelics. And to be fair, that's probably where the term is most commonly used. Now, I didn't come up with the term ego death, and a lot of people have used it before to mean a couple of different things. Some define ego death as a complete dissolution of self-awareness, while others see it as a transcendence beyond personal identity, often linked to some things like enlightenment or spiritual awakening. But the concept I will be discussing today is more of a framework I've constructed myself. It focuses on ego death as a transformation of identity that can take different forms, some permanent and some reversible. But before we get into that, let me take you back to a personal experience which first made me question what it truly means to lose the self. A while ago, I decided to partake in only what I can call silly medicine because of YouTube TOS, specifically a heroic dose of silly mushrooms. Now, for some context, a normal dose of silly mushrooms is from around 1 to 3.5 grams, and anything above that is a heroic dose. So I decided to take about 7 to 8 grams, I don't really remember. I didn't want to just have like the conventional and trippy experience. I really wanted to explore the deepest corners of my mind. And that I did. That night, I experienced what I can only describe as ego death. So what happened? What did it feel like? Well, before I answer those questions, let's go back to our definition of the ego. In the last video, we defined it as a dynamic set of properties that make up the self. But every set has a boundary, which separates what is in the set and what is not. When it comes to the ego, this boundary is what divides you from, well, not you. And that night, that boundary dissolved. To better explain that, let's take a look at my chair. This is my chair. My chair is red and black, it has wheels, and it's in my room. I'm also in my room, so I guess we share that property, but I have properties that my chair doesn't. For example, I don't have wheels.
If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike. You know what,
So we can safely say there's a boundary between my set and my chair set. But again, during the trip, that boundary blurred. It wasn't that I thought I was my chair, that I suddenly believed I had wheels, but the distinction between me and, well, everything else felt arbitrary. My identity didn't feel like it was something fixed. Instead, it felt soft, malleable, and dissolving into something bigger than itself. As Carter Phillips defines it, the ego is the renunciation, rejection, ultimately the death of the need to hold on to a separate, self-centered existence. The key word here is separate, because at some point I didn't feel separate from, well, anything at all. The best way I can describe this is through bubbles. Imagine a massive cluster of bubbles, something that you see when washing the dishes, something I obviously do all of the time. If you zoom in, you see individual bubbles, each with a thin, fragile wall separating them. That's the boundary. One of these bubbles is you, and another is the device that you're watching this on. The walls between them define what is you and what is not you. But what happens when the bubbles start merging? At first, they stick together, forming larger and larger clusters. Then, slowly, their walls weaken, stretch, and dissolve. Eventually, they all merge into one giant bubble. At that point, where does one end and another begin? And if you are just another bubble in this vast cosmos, what happens when that bubble pops? At first it feels beautiful. You're not separate from anything else, but then some unsettling feelings start to creep in. If everything is you, then nothing is separate from you anymore. But if nothing is separate from you anymore, then who even are you? Do you even exist? It's a strange and uncanny feeling, something that I don't think can be replicated with anything besides maybe some super insane deep 30-year commitment to meditation or so-called silly medicine. But this is just one way that the ego dies. There's another way the self can disappear. Not one that just blurs the edges, but that erases it completely. But to explore that, I'm gonna have to get up. Losing the boundary between yourself and the world is one thing, but what if you didn't just dissolve? What if you were rewritten? What if instead of fading into everything, you became unrecognizable? That is what I call substance ego death. Imagine you have a wooden chair. It has 4 legs, a seat, and a backrest, and it functions as a chair. But now let's start changing it. Remove the backrest and shorten the legs. Now it kind of looks like a coffee table. It still exists, the wood is still there, it just no longer functions as a chair, it's something else entirely. That's substance ego death. The material remains, but the essential identity, the essence of what made it a chair has disappeared. But people are way more complicated than chairs. Our identities aren't just defined by one function or can't be just reduced to one characteristic. So how do we determine whether a person has changed so much that they are not the same person anymore? Let's push this further. Imagine you get into a terrible accident, an accident so big that you lose every single memory that you have ever had. You don't remember your name, your family, your past. You don't remember how to walk, write, or speak. Now, fast forward 10 years. Although your prognosis was awful, you have relearned everything. You are back to where you once were. However, this time you've done it a little different. You speak with a different accent. You've picked up new hobbies or interests that you couldn't even imagine yourself doing before. Maybe you used to be confident, but now you're introverted and you don't even laugh at the same types of jokes anymore. No matter how you frame it, the set of your ego has fundamentally changed. Every property that made you, well, you is now fundamentally different. So then I ask you, is that still you? Or did the person that suffered that terrible accident die that day? But an even more interesting question, what is the property or collection of properties that had to change for that person to die? At first, I thought the obvious answer was memory. Memory seems to be the glue that holds yourself together. After all, in this example, the one thing that changed was your memory. Everything else really remained the same besides your memory. And then to back up my point, ChatGPT recommended I watch Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind. However, that did the exact opposite. Eternal Sunshine is a story about memory and love following 2 individuals, Joel and Clementine, through a non-linear narrative. Now, before I go any further, I highly recommend you watch this movie. It's genuinely beautiful. The cinematography is phenomenal, the writing is, dare I say, perfect, and despite it being made in 2004, just like ya brother, it still feels timeless. I'll give you one more chance. Highly recommend you watch this movie. Okay, let's talk about it. The core premise of this movie revolves around a couple whose relationship becomes deeply unhealthy. Honestly, I think it was doomed from the start, but that's besides the point. Clementine, in a moment of impulsivity, something that isn't rare for her, undergoes a procedure to erase all memories of Joel. When Joel finds out, he chooses to do the same. Clementine is deeply embedded in Joel's mind. When asked to gather items that remind him of her, he clears out half his fucking apartment. It's not just a few mementos, it's 2 years of his life, and yet, the very next day, Joel and Clementine meet again, and it's love at first sight. Now, even with their memories erased, they're still drawn to each other. Their instincts, tendencies, and personalities remain intact. Sure, you could argue that the procedure wasn't perfect. I mean, half of the show's premise is that it wasn't perfect. Halfway through the procedure, Joel starts to fight back against the procedure. However, it still kind of goes through. But if I were to take that for granted, if I were to 100% accept that idea, why does Clementine, who erased Joel first, who appears to not have fought back the treatment in any way, shape, or form, make the first move? Again, I originally thought this film would back up my argument of the memory, but I think it did the exact opposite. It made me really question whether memory matters at all, which then forces me to return back to White Bear. Now, I know we covered this in the last video, and I was purposely trying to avoid this show for that very reason. However, there is a horse, and he is dead, but he has to be beaten. If you remember, in the last video, I brought up the question of whether we were torturing the same person. The main reason I was questioning this is when Victoria was confronted with her murders, she was horrified. She was devastated. And of course, I assume this was simply because she completely forgot that she committed the crimes. But what if it wasn't just about memory loss? What if, as a result of erasing her past, the part of her that was able to commit that crime was also erased? If that's the case, and the person committing the crime truly isn't the same person, and dare I say, doesn't deserve the punishment. This completely changes how I view identity. Again, before writing the script for this video, I viewed memory as the glue that holds the set together. But now I'm forced to scrap that idea. Instead, what I think defines identity and composes the most fundamental core aspects of identity are thoughts, behaviors, impulses, but most importantly, conscious thoughts. Because when you think about it, memory alone doesn't dictate who you are. If it did, then wiping memories would mean wiping away your identity, but I feel like the lesson that we can learn from Eternal Sunshine is that that's not necessarily the case. Now, to be fair, Joel and Clementine didn't lose every single memory they've ever had, but they lost every memory of each other. And despite that, their personalities, chemistries, and impulses still remained the same. Their instincts and tendencies still pushed them together even when their past memories of each other were completely erased. And I think the same logic applies to White Bear, however in reverse. Victoria's horror isn't just a reaction to a missing past. I think it's proof that she is no longer the person who committed the crime. If the part of her that was capable of such an act is gone, could we really consider her to be the same person? It's not just about forgetting, it's about not being able to make the same choices. I believe this changes everything. Memory isn't the foundation of the self. It's just a record of what the self has experienced. It's not about the past that we remember, but instead it's about the patterns that dictate how we navigate the present. True substance ego death isn't just about forgetting. It's about becoming someone unrecognizable to your former self. It's not about erasing the past, but transforming yourself so deeply that even in the exact same circumstances, you would make different choices. And that raises a bigger question: if the self can die, how many times have you died? How many versions of you have disappeared without you even noticing? You look back at old photos, old messages, and old memories, and they feel like they belong to someone else. But what if it's not just that we change? What if we're different people entirely? In the next video, we're going to be exploring a theory that I created myself with my own blood, sweat, and tears called multiple people theory. It's a theory that we aren't just different versions of the same people over time, but we are inherently and fundamentally different people throughout our lives. And that has implications for so much shit. Law, morality, memory, regret, relationships, everything. So to end this video, I'm going to leave you with 3 questions. How many times have you died? If all of your former selves stood in front of you, would they recognize who they had become? But more importantly, would they be proud of the person that stands before you? Thank you so much for watching. I love you so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. I'm going to get back into the closet now. Fuck, man, why do I do this to myself? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Bye!